I mean, I was talking to a medical doctor the other day, and she talked about how when she was going to the Albert Einstein Medical Institution, I talked to Harvard medicals as well, who were graduating 30, 40 years ago, they would, if there was a child in the ward that had cancer, it was like going to look at, the last right whale. I mean, it was so rare that it was like, oh my God. And now there's just kids all around me in my neighborhood dying, people dying everywhere. This is a Holocaust.
It was interesting. This particular scientist, she was harassed. She was set up and attacked. She came to her office once, and there was a paper that had been burnt on her desk. She had samples stolen, and she was eventually taken off the ability to do any more GMO research because her director was pressured by his director. So another scientist at this institute went up to her and tried to comfort her by actually saying, well, maybe the genetically engineered soy will solve the overpopulation problem on the Earth.
Oh.
Which was supposed to comfort her. Now, another team in Italy... Stop,
sir. This is too... I got to have you back next. This is too incredible, and we're running out of time. We've got 1 minute before this break ends. This segment, specifically the name of this lady, where this was. Oh, don't worry, the overpopulation, because I've actually found, sir, it's all by design. I know you don't go that far. You stick with the, this area. But it always comes up. Go back to that little story, a little more specifics.
Sure. All right. Her name is Dr. Irina Ermakova, and there was some interesting things about her research. She had done this research 3 times when she fed mother rats genetically engineered soy, and each time there's a huge death rate and also smaller offspring, really runt-like offspring. And a very interesting twist happened after she did her 3 research studies, which I'll tell you about after the break.
What I'm going to do, because in the interest of time, I'm going to skip this break for the internet listeners and video, folks watching at prisonplanet.tv, and we'll come back and get into all the other areas when we return. Time is too valuable. Stay with us. Flesh out the rest of her story, and then we'll come back.
Each time they had over 50% average death rate and a much smaller offspring. Now, after 3 times, spontaneously and coincidentally, the clinic itself, the facility that she worked at, switched over to a rat feed that was all genetically soy-based. So it was all GM soy in the rat feed. So she couldn't do any more studies because she had no controls. All of the rats in the facility were being fed GM soy. But after 2 months, she went to her colleagues and said, in your studies, which were not GM-related, what is the offspring mortality rate? It had skyrocketed facility-wide to 56.3%. Now, this means that it wasn't just her particular batch of GM soy that was causing this problem. It was generic problem with GM soy in general. And so this demonstrates that this could be happening to us. Now, we have additional studies. Hold
on. Could be. I mean, they study rats with drugs and chemicals and GMO because they're so similar to us with their whole metabolic system. And I mean, you just had the Austrian study last week, totally separate, another GMO. Well, that was corn, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, that was actually the reproductive study last week was a corn that was not only producing its own pesticide, but was also Roundup ready, meaning it was designed not to die.
There's no doubt. This has to stop now. I mean, I don't mean to get emotional here, but I'm fighting to not have my kids eat this, and I'm not a wealthy person, but I'm middle class, and it's very expensive for me. Poor families, as you know, can't afford this.
Well, in our shopping guide, we show that you can even go and buy, non-organic, regular stuff off the supermarket shelves if you read the ingredients and you avoid basically the offspring of soy, corn, cotton, and canola, the 4 major GM crops.
Because those are the really deadly ones.
Well, those are the ones that are everywhere. Now, unfortunately, this year and probably this month, for the first time, our sugar supply has been contaminated.
Okay, let's come back to the full audience. Let's go back to the eugenics. It's okay, honey, if 56% of the rats are sterile and a bunch of them are dying when we feed them this. The Earth's got too many people. Specifically, where was she when that was done?
I'm sorry, where was...
You were telling the story of them coming to the scientist and saying, don't worry if it's killing making the rats sick and sterile. We need to get rid of the people.
Right.
I mean, come on.
Yeah, she told me this. We had just given a presentation together at the European Parliament, and she was really frustrated because she couldn't do any more studies. Someone finally came to her and said, okay, you can do GMO studies if you sign this contract that says you can't talk about your research for at least 3 years, and we can replace any of your cohorts with any of our chosen people and you have no choice about it. So she couldn't sign that because it was basically signing away all of her independence. But so she found out that not only were the offspring dying, but she took the offspring that survived and tried to mate those together, and they would not conceive. They never got pregnant.
Bioweapon.
So there was.
Go ahead.
It's interesting that another study in Italy also fed the same genetically engineered soy, which grows on 91% of all soy fields in the United States. They fed it to mice, and then they looked under an electron microscope at the testicles of the mice, and it turns out that there was damaged young sperm cells. Then they took parent mice, gave parent mice the genetically engineered soy, and had them mate together. Then they took out an embryo, a young embryo, or several of them, and looked at the DNA of the young embryo, and it was functioning differently compared to the DNA of embryos whose parents were fed normal genetically engineered soy. Now, when I went to the EU Parliament...
Stay there. We've got to come back. We've got to come back to the full audience and recap that. Here we go. All right, finishing up, Jeffrey, I know it's a little bit skilted when I've got you behind the scenes talking when we come back. You were finishing up with these rats that had been bred together, that had been fed GMO. The embryos themselves were different genetics. Finish up with that, and then recap in any more specifics you've got about. She goes to them and they say, she's distraught, and they say, "Don't worry, this will contribute to world overpopulation." Which, of course, she was compartmentalized. She wasn't told that was the whole point. I know you won't go that far. I will. I've made the film Endgame, Blueprint for Global Enslavement. Then let's get into the $64 billion or $1 trillion question. The fight is now. They are proliferating GMO into everything, and now is the time to stop them. Go ahead.
Absolutely. All right, let's just talk about the reproductive issues, because there's more about reproduction and the failure of animals who've been fed GMOs to reproduce. It's actually not just in the laboratory. We're seeing it among livestock, and I'll show you. I'll tie it all together right now. So we left off with Irina Ermakova. It was at the EU Parliament offices. We had just given a talk, and she tells me that she can't do any more studies because she's been taken off the job, and that someone tried to comfort her, saying that maybe it'll solve the overpopulation problem. Now, at that conference, she also showed a slide of testicles of rats that were fed genetically engineered soy, and compared to the testicles of rats that were fed regular soy. The testicles of rats that were fed regular soy were pink. Those that were fed GM soy were blue, a completely different color. She showed slides of the cells. They were completely different structure. In mice in Italy that were fed genetically engineered soy from a different group, they looked under an electron microscope and found damage in the young sperm cells associated with the mice that were fed genetically engineered soy. They looked into the DNA or the cells of the embryos from the offspring of mice that were fed GM soy, and they function differently. There's a temporary disruption in the production of RNA from the DNA in these mice compared to when the mothers and fathers were fed non-GM soy. Now we fast forward to last month, and mice that were fed corn that was genetically engineered also showed infertility issues and damage in the offspring. Now we look at what's happened in Iowa and around the world, around the country, a few years ago, when certain varieties of genetically engineered corn appeared to be causing sterility in pigs and cows. I talked to one farmer, Jerry Roseman, and he said, he tried everything, couldn't figure out what was going on, and then he found some other people that also had sterility in their pigs, and it turns out they were feeding the same genetically engineered corn. So he went to the company, Garst, and said, your corn, they went as a group, all three of them, and said, your corn may be causing our pigs to become sterile. So they gave him a sample of corn, and the Garst never got back to him. So they had one of the Garst reps call the headquarters, and he said, you're never going to believe this, Jerry, they lost your sample. So they claimed that they lost the sample, and so Jerry called him back and said, don't worry, I've been saving 20,000 bushels of corn to do research on. You're welcome to come to get more. And they never did. When it hit the papers a year later, Garst immediately went on television and the radio and papers and said, we've done our studies and it wasn't the corn. The same studies that's supposedly on this missing sample. Every time it was broadcast on radio, television, or newspaper or magazine, Jerry would get more calls from more farmers that said, I'm having the same problem. No one was willing to do the research on his corn to see if that was causing the problem. In fact, supposedly a USDA or a university group was going to get together and try and create a study that was specifically designed to disprove that it was the corn, because they weren't even going to test his corn. Well, he had to do his own study, and he took his own corn and he fed it to his cows and his bulls, and immediately they got sterile also. And there's more.
Well, this is the biggest story. Let's come back in our final segment with you, Jeffrey Smith, and again talk about the proliferation of all of these systems and how we stop it. And of course, humans are also becoming sterile or infertile, right in line with the other mammals that are eating this. Ladies and gentlemen, this is by design. Make no mistake.